American Meteorological Society's policy program is supported in part by a public-private partnership.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Erica Goldman, the Director of Policy Engagement for Compass. Compass, for those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit, non-advocacy organization that works to help effectively connect scientists to become effective communicators and connect what they do to relevant discourse on the environment. And we are super thrilled to be hosting the briefing today in partnership with the American Meteorological Society. And I'd like to first recognize the tremendous work of my colleagues Heather Mannix and Yael Sayed-Green from the American Meteorological Society for their work in developing today's event. And we'd also like to extend our sincere thanks to Senators Booker and Gillibrand for making this briefing possible. We're really excited to have four prominent scientists here today to talk with you about the potential of natural infrastructure to enhance coastal resilience. As we approach the third anniversary of Hurricane Sandy next week, and in the wake of some significant flooding in South Carolina earlier this month, we're acutely aware of just how vulnerable our coastal communities can be to storms and flooding. Thanks to an enormous investment in research and pilot projects in the aftermath of Sandy and other storms, we're steadily improving our understanding of the protection benefits of natural infrastructure and learning how to use new approaches to potentially increase multiple benefits under a range of conditions. You'll hear more about all of this in a moment from our panel. And I'd just like to turn it over to our moderator for today's briefing, David Malakoff, who's the Deputy News Editor for Science Magazine. David's going to give a few additional remarks to help set the stage and then introduce the panel and hopefully moderate a lively discussion afterwards. So thanks for coming and enjoy.
Thanks, Erica. I'm David Malakoff. I work at Science, which you may know is a scientific journal, but we also have a news section up front that's sort of like Time or Newsweek for scientists. And I coordinate our coverage of policy, the environment, and energy. We also have an free online news service called Science Insider, which focuses specifically on science policy and science politics and controversies. This is a great panel for this topic. We had a very quiet storm season here in the East this year, but as you know, in the past, that was not true. We came from the sea many, many hundreds of millions of years ago, and it seems like human beings have spent the rest of our lives trying to get back to it. And as a result, we have huge communities and very invaluable infrastructure now all along our coastline. So the topic we're talking about has importance to a lot of people and to our economy. A couple of background notes. First of all, Hurricane Sandy, as you know, enormously damaging storm, prompted huge reaction from state and federal governments, including a number of executive branch actions. So just to remind you of the policy implications here, there's been a lot of activity in the executive branch looking at these kinds of issues. And in particular, there have been a couple of reports that have come out which have emphasized the need for research and to better understand the options that we have in trying to protect our coastlines. And so you'll be hearing the speakers discuss a little bit about what we know and what we don't know in answering the kinds of questions that policymakers often have about investments and what works and what does not work. The other thing that may be a little confusing if you're not familiar with this issue is you'll hear a lot of terminology about natural systems or built systems or engineered systems. And each of the speakers is going to have, to some degree, their own language for describing these systems. But in general, what we're talking about here there's a sort of a category of purely engineered systems, right? A lot of poured concrete, seawalls, things that human beings design and build. Then there's sort of another category of things which try to mimic natural systems, whether it be a wetland, a sand dune, an oyster reef, some of these things that nature has made which turn out to protect shorelines, and we can often build structures that mimic the way those structures behave. But while they are inspired by nature, they often require bulldozers and all kinds of human activity on the shoreline. And then there's a third category of protective devices, which are simply letting nature do its thing, letting a wetland grow and not destroying it, or letting sand move naturally up and down beaches as opposed to blocking the movement of sediment up and down beaches, which can sometimes have deleterious effects. So you'll hear some different terminology, but just I would say those are sort of the three broad categories. And with that, I'm going to remind you that we're going to have questions at the end. We're hoping to leave anywhere from 20 minutes to 30 minutes. There'll be a microphone which will circulate, so just raise your hand. So start thinking up your questions now, and I'm going to turn it over to Ariana.
Thank you. So I'm Ariana Sutton-Grier, and I have a dual affiliation. So I wanted to just really fast explain that. I am research faculty at the University of Maryland, but I also sit at the National Ocean Service at NOAA. So I actually get to be a really neat bridge between the academic community and government. But I just want to clarify, I don't speak on behalf of NOAA because I'm not a NOAA employee. So Hurricane Sandy was really a turning point in my view in terms of the way the federal family is thinking about, one, the need for coastal protection of our coastal communities around the country, but also in terms of thinking about how we go about getting that coastal protection and the fact that there are natural opportunities for protection, so we don't have to just think about our traditional opportunities. So what do I mean by natural infrastructure opportunities? Well, so when we think about coastal protection, we often think first about the traditional built opportunities, things like seawalls, levees, dikes, etc. But when we say natural infrastructure, these systems, and here I'm talking about things like salt marsh, coral and oyster reefs, mangroves, and beaches and dunes, these natural systems also provide storm protection. So that's what we mean when we say natural infrastructure. Now, how does natural infrastructure actually work to provide storm protection? So in this top figure, what you're seeing are waves coming in from the ocean, and then they hit this tidal marsh. And the waves actually break and start to slow down so that by the time that wave hits this dike back here, this built feature, which we want to protect, the waves have greatly slowed. They've lost a lot of energy and they've lost a lot of their height. So that is how natural systems, whether they're a tidal marsh or a reef or a beach or a dune, that's how they function to provide that particular service. So there are many factors that influence the amount of coastal protection provided by natural infrastructure, and you're actually going to hear a little bit more from Mary about this today, hopefully. But some of these factors include the amount of area of the habitat. For vegetated systems, the density of the vegetation matters for slowing down water. And then for reef systems, the depth of the reef and the crest height, that front piece that's typically the highest part of the reef, matters as to how much storm protection is provided. So here's an example of natural infrastructure being used to protect this community. And what I want to actually highlight here is that when we talk about natural infrastructure, you don't have to use just one approach. So this is a layered approach where this community may have decided that they wanted to restore a barrier island. Maybe they were also either protecting or restoring existing oyster beds and salt marshes. So now they have this triple layer of natural protection. And what's really interesting about natural infrastructure is that there are benefits that distinguish these types of opportunities from our typical built opportunities. So for example, natural infrastructure can strengthen with time. In fact, if you're restoring a system, it's often weakest the very first day you've finished the project, and it grows stronger with time. They can be self-maintaining, and they have the potential for self-repair after storms. They can also grow and keep pace with sea level rise, and this is a really important point. So things like reefs and marshes and mangroves continue to accrete sediment and can keep pace with sea level rise. They can also potentially shift inland and keep pace with sea level rise if there isn't some man-made structure to block them from moving. Built structures clearly don't change unless you go back and change them yourself. So these features can actually adapt with sea level rise. These systems can be more cost-effective to actually build in the first place, and Liz and Mary will speak a little bit more about that. And these systems provide what I'm going to call co-benefits all the time, not just the storm protection benefits. So when I say co-benefits, I'm thinking about things like they provide fishery habitat for important recreational or commercial fisheries. They provide recreation opportunities for people. They provide water quality improvements, and they can provide carbon sequestration and storage in some cases. They're providing those co-benefits at all times. And so you really get more than just the storm protection when you put in a natural infrastructure opportunity. Now, I was actually asked to do a synthesis of what was our knowledge on the state of natural infrastructure and how it provides storm protection benefits. And in doing that synthesis from my leadership at NOAA, I discovered that at the same time that there's a lot we know and growing knowledge about natural infrastructure, there's a lot of really exciting innovation around what I call hybrid approaches. You may hear some of us talk about other things, like Ted will talk about integrated approaches. Similar concept. Here we're combining features of the natural or green infrastructure with built features. And so in this picture, you see this community has the same triple set of natural features I talked about. And in addition, this community has chosen to put in a floodgate, which stays open most of the time, but when a storm is approaching, they can close that floodgate and it will provide additional protection. That's what I mean by hybrid. We're using a built component and natural components. So some of the benefits of hybrid include that they really capitalize on the strengths of both green and gray approaches. You can use gray to protect green as it establishes, or green to protect gray so that the lifetime of the gray infrastructure is longer. And so really you can get more benefits sometimes when you combine these approaches. So in doing this research, one of the things we also discovered is that although we know a fair amount, there are still some key research gaps that really could help to support the inclusion of these approaches into policy. And so first, we really could use more information on how do natural and hybrid benefits actually accrue. How do these different systems under different conditions provide the benefits that we want for storm protection? Second, getting more at a social science question, what's the value that these services provide? How much are we actually protecting? And then the co-benefits, what's the value of the co-benefits? Because we need all that information to inform cost-benefit analyses when comparing green or hybrid options to gray options. Third, we need best practices for how to design these systems better. And this needs to be a multidisciplinary effort. And this will help to build capacity so that we have a better understanding of where do we put in what types of features. There's really no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to green infrastructure. And then finally, we've come a long way on understanding the benefits that these hybrid and natural systems can provide, but we need more work on how do we implement these strategies? How could policy better support the implementation of natural and hybrid options? So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Please follow up with me by email. A lot of this stuff is in a publication that you'll find in the Shoring Up handout, and it's available open access, so anybody can get to it with internet. Please get to that, share it with others. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Todd Bridges.
Thank you, Ariana. My name's Todd Bridges. I'm the Army's Senior Research Scientist for Environmental Science. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, specifically at the Engineer Research and Development Center. And I'm going to start off this afternoon by comparing two coastal storms separated in time by more than 100 years. Galveston, Texas, at the turn of the last century, was essentially the commercial center for the state of Texas. There were about 38,000 people living in Galveston, the city on the Galveston Island. It was one of the three top population centers in the state of Texas at the time, along with Dallas and Houston. And in 1900, we had the worst, most fatal natural disaster in U.S. history, the Galveston storm of 1900. It was a Category 4 storm, estimated, based on information that's available. That storm killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people on Galveston Island. The best estimates are quoted as being 8,000 dead. Coastal resilience is serious business because lives are at stake. There were so many dead, in fact, that burial was impossible. So funeral pyres burned day and night on Galveston Island for weeks after the storm. So you can imagine what sort of impression this makes on the local population and their desire for coastal protection in the aftermath of the storm. That was the genesis for the Galveston seawall, which you see pictured here on the bottom left. This was a gargantuan engineering undertaking, and over a period of 60 years, this more than 10-mile-long seawall was constructed. Dredging occurred. Sand was used to raise the elevation of the forward-facing part of Galveston Island more than 17 feet. And that seawall is 17 feet tall and 16 feet wide, and it's 10 miles long. This picture symbolizes the degree of security that the people living on Galveston Island attached to their new seawall. This picture is from 1911 and the opening of the then brand new Hotel Galvez that was constructed at a whopping sum of $1 million, but in 1911 dollars, that was a lot of money. And you can see here on the right-hand side of the image, this woman in a long skirt is walking along, in fact, the seawall itself. So 11 years after the storm, how do people respond? Whoops, they develop. And in the case of the Galvez Hotel, it's 100 yards off of the breaking waves on the beach and off of the seawall. It's a beautiful structure. I stayed there last month when the Corps of Engineers Coastal Engineering Research Board met on Galveston Island. The next storm, go flash forward 112 years, and we have Hurricane Sandy. And everybody in this room is probably familiar in regards to the impacts associated with Hurricane Sandy. And one of the lessons learned that was gained concerns natural infrastructure, or what we in the Corps call natural and nature-based features. And this figure actually comes from a New York City report. In fact, I think the photos are credited to NOAA in that report. But on the top image here, you have the beach and dune at 56th Street on Rockaway Peninsula. And on these lower pictures here, you have the beach without a dune at 94th Street. So in the first picture, you have before Sandy. Second picture is after Sandy. So what you can tell here at 94th Street, if you just look at the before and after, if you look at the after, you can see the extent to which sand was pushed, not by wind, but by the flood surge, by the water. There was extensive flooding behind that beach, which lacked a dune. At 56th Street, with the presence of the dune, there was relatively little flooding. The same event, they're not separated by that many blocks, as it turns out, 56th Street, 94th Street, it's the same coastline. This beach was constructed by the Corps of Engineers in the 1970s, okay? And it was last nourished in 2004 by the Corps by using dredging equipment, placing more sand, building a sand berm on that beach. New York City Parks used sand fencing in the back part of the beach, so combined with wind transport of sand particles over time, sand fencing that holds those particles in place, sand that the Corps placed there, these dunes developed over time and vegetated. So this, and there are several other projects similar to this that had demonstrated along the coastline of the Northeast Atlantic the value of these nature-based systems. The epilogue to the Galveston story is that in the years leading up to 1900, the dunes, natural dunes on Galveston Beach, were purposefully removed. And the sand was taken from them, scavenged to fill low-lying areas on the island and to provide easier access for tourists to the beach. Ariana already went through the types of natural-based features, if you will, that we're talking about here, and to a large degree, the kinds of processes. These features all work differently. They have to be supported by different kinds of natural as well as engineering processes. And they all pretty much function the same way in regards to the fact that they increase elevation, which you need to be able to provide storm protection. And the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study was a direction that we got from Congress, $20 million of work that was performed over this period of time. We generated work in the form of these three reports that are referenced in that handout that you may have picked up on the front desk. The first activity in 2013, we published a position paper within the Corps to describe how we view the integration of conventional infrastructure with natural infrastructure. The Sandy Comprehensive Study report is pictured here, was delivered to Congress in January of this year. And then our a technical report on the use of natural and nature-based features to support coastal resilience. I had the pleasure of leading this team of 30 engineers and scientists within the Corps. In this effort, it's a tome of a report, 400 pages in length, represents a lot of effort over 2 years to frame this opportunity and to pursue these kinds of opportunities to integrate these strategies into infrastructure systems. No details, but we developed a framework. Not going to focus on details here, but we developed a framework to help guide the identification of these opportunities and how they could be implemented, including organizing the organizations, if you will, that would be contributing to these kinds of projects. That's no small undertaking by itself. Evaluating these opportunities, using science and engineering to evaluate whether or not you can get the kind of performance from these integrated systems that the setting requires. And then implementing them. How do you combine the resources and the opportunities that exist? How do you combine dredging projects in the Corps' navigation program with these opportunities to support coastal resilience through infrastructure? Ariana already touched upon this, and others will as well, but the opportunities for using natural and nature-based systems varies by context, right? The setting, the physical setting, what scientists call the geomorphology, right? Not everything, not all of the opportunities that we might discuss here are going to be appropriate in every physical setting. And so that has to be informed by an understanding of the vulnerabilities and what is giving rise to them. But it supports this idea of multiple layers of defense. And I think that's where one of the true strengths and advantages of natural nature-based approaches reside. Some next steps in regard to science and engineering. You know, how will we integrate infrastructure systems that will evolve over time in dynamic coastal environments? What processes and engineering requirements are critical to determining performance? How can integrated systems be assembled to reduce long-term operations and maintenance? We're doing, for example, flume studies where we generate waves in a flume environment in a laboratory, and we look at how the friction generated by wetlands affects the orbital velocities of waves. How does this process work? And we have to have those kinds of data to be able to incorporate them into our engineering tools and models. And then how can field-scale demonstrations, which I think are quite important as a way of advancing our practice over time, doing things in the field for real and learning from those efforts. And these are things that we're doing in combination with our Engineering with Nature program in the Corps, which began in 2010. Final thoughts. There's a lot of engineering potential in natural nature-based features. That's true. But this is serious business for the reasons I hope I've demonstrated to you. And so the approaches that we take to inform ourselves about how to do this kind of integration have to be informed by sound and credible science and engineering practice. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mary.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, I'm Mary Ruckelshaus, and I'm the director of the Natural Capital Project. And we work on sort of the demand side of these issues, so work with decision makers to co-develop science and solutions. So our ancestors had it right. They built their small villages and communities sort of tucked in behind a lot of the coastal habitats because they knew that that conferred protection from storms and other coastal hazards. As several of our speakers have already said, as we have advanced in our development, we've tried to get closer and closer to the water and get better and better views, and we tend to forget the values that these habitats, these natural shields are providing to us. And I think that decision makers, in particular two I'll highlight throughout my talk, public sector, mayors, governors, even regional public sector bodies are really interested in trying to now capture the value of these coastal habitats for protection. And also the private sector, business, especially reinsurance industry, realizes that their risk and hazard maps include implicitly the value of these habitats, marshes, dunes, wetlands, et cetera, and they'd like to explicitly account for that. In the cases where we're degrading or destroying these habitats, what does that do to the risk? So one analysis that we did initially that was really, again, based on questions, the first question that a lot of these decision makers asked us was, where might these coastal habitats be conferring protection or conversely causing excess vulnerability? So this shows the first risk evaluation for the whole United States that really highlights the risk mitigation potential of natural habitats. And it has about 8 different habitat types here. And the warmer colors show where those habitats, if they're lost, would be causing incredible vulnerability for both flooding and erosion from coastal hazards. So you can see there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's some hot spots of warmth in these maps and other places where it's not really that big of a value that's currently being conferred from those habitats. The other question people often ask, which is also in this analysis, is who or what is being protected, or conversely, what's most vulnerable. So you can map infrastructure and also the socioeconomic conditions of those populations. And it turns out that for the United States, the greatest areas where populations are at risk, the most vulnerable, the elderly and lower socioeconomic populations, where habitats are protecting them are along the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic. So you can really zoom in at a number of different scales. But currently, it's good to know 67% of the U.S. coastline is currently protected by some kind of coastal habitat. So we shouldn't forget that as we make our development plans and shore up our coastlines. If you zoom in on that national scale analysis, you can see more spatial variation in the values of these habitats. And what decision makers also ask beyond the where is the value is how much. How much value in protection for coastlines can these habitats provide? So this just shows a couple of places very much in the vicinity of Galveston Bay that Todd just talked about. If you can see these dark lines, those are essentially transects that you can include in a modeling analysis to look at different places within Galveston Bay and how much value, protection value, the marsh provides. In this case, it's in the sense of how much in a reduction in levee height. So these are what Ariana mentioned. In many cases, there already are seawalls or levees in place to protect property or infrastructure or people. And in this case, just within the West Bay part of Galveston, the marsh value in reducing levee height can be up to 50% if you have a marsh in front of a seawall. And in some other places, it's only 15%. And that variation happens because of the biophysical characteristics of the habitat. So if you have a very shallow bathymetry underwater, and then the topography is also shallow, if you have a big wide marsh fringe, then the protection value of that area is greater than if you had a very steep slope. It also has to do with what properties are you protecting. Is it a high value property, a high value road, for example, or not? The second place here that we looked at right around the corner from Galveston Bay was for the Dow Chemical Company, where they asked us what value might the wetlands provide for us in protecting our physical plant. This is their biggest chemical production facility in the Gulf, very prone to hurricanes and other coastal hazards. Where the Dow facility is, the wetland value in reducing the levee height was only 2%. It was negligible. So it just shows you that these strategies can be very helpful, but it really matters to get the science right so that you can figure out just how valuable they might be. Other thing that decision makers often want, and Todd touched on this, is what is the cost effectiveness of these strategies. So when we say cost effectiveness, we mean comparing two strategies, either a green strategy with a gray strategy, or you can look at a green and gray together like we've talked about. And many decision makers, especially in the public sector, want to know, for example, this coastal California is an access point, and as sea level rises, as storm intensity increases over time, is it worth it? Is it cost effective for them to maintain these beach access points? Or should they, in some cases, abandon those? Or in some cases, should they shore up that habitat with dunes or wetlands? So these are very practical problems, and we know now how to include cost effectiveness assessments to help them answer those trade-off decisions. So just in closing, what we're finding in a number of cases around the United States and around the world is that in cases where green infrastructure is included, the cost effectiveness will be higher. So it's more likely that a decision maker will find, quote, in favor of using a green infrastructure solution when it's a hybrid solution. So, oops, sorry. Uh-oh. Sorry, Liz. I ruined your story. Your punchline, you guys didn't see that, right? There's a marsh here in front of a seawall that in those cases, cost effectiveness tends to be higher. And then similarly, as Ariana introduced the idea of co-benefits, in many cases there might be a private benefit. For example, in the Dow Chemical Facility case where they had some protection benefit from the marsh or not. But if you look at co-benefits, oh gosh, where there are recreation benefits because the marshes provide shrimp and drum nursery habitat, carbon sequestration and water filtration benefits, and also commercial fisheries, then often that cost effectiveness equation gets flipped very strongly in favor of these intermediate green hybrid solutions. So thanks for listening, and now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Liz Smith.
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Smith. I'm an environmental and resource economist working with the Nature Conservancy in New York. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes sort of playing on what my colleagues have just explained to you and talk about a case study that was done in New York to illustrate the how and why around the importance of including these benefits of natural infrastructure into the decision-making process. So I've been teed up really well. Oh, there I am. Sorry about that. So this study is a conceptual study that was done at the request of the New York City Mayor's office after Sandy. It was, when I say a conceptual study, I mean it's focused on a specific geography, as you can see here, Howard Beach, Queens, New York. But the alternatives that we evaluated were to provide information to think about the trade-offs of different types of infrastructure. So Howard Beach, low-lying coastal community you see on that left-hand picture, and on the right, badly, badly damaged during Sandy. So it serves as a good case study for us. So this infographic is, again, just another view of this community to give you a sense of the features there, and then the types of components of the different alternatives that we looked at, from mussel beds and marshes to sea gates and how about seawalls and floodgates? Now, I won't be able to go through everything today, but I wanted to give a sort of big picture overview of where we're going and what the results were. So the green to gray arrow that you see on the bottom, I'll carry that through the results of the next two slides. But as my colleagues have teed up, so if you look all the way on the right-hand side, you'll see alternative 5 is gray. That means that alternative that we evaluated only had gray infrastructure in it, floodgates and seawalls. All the way on the left, you see the green. We looked at two different alternatives that were composed of natural features only, restored and created wetlands, mussel beds, and berms. And then we also looked at two alternatives that were a mix of the green and gray features. And the whole point for this study, looking at 5 different alternatives, was to really systematically look at the differences and the trade-offs across these different infrastructure options. Okay, so you're going to bear with me here, but this slide will actually give you sort of the big picture sense of everything that we did. So knowing that we need the benefits of natural infrastructure to be in a form that's readily usable by decision makers. So how do we do that? Because if we don't, then we're making decisions on what I would say is insufficient information. So if you look at the green, I'll just walk you through this really quick. So the green represents the costs and benefits that were included in this analysis. That brighter green really gets the costs, and the lighter green, the benefits of natural infrastructure and the avoided property damages. The blue running across the middle, just to highlight the methodology that was used. I'm not going to get into specifics. And then that tanny color, how the output was produced. Usually dollars, but not always. If you include this full picture here, and you'll see that I've highlighted those last 2 columns to say the benefits of natural infrastructure. When we include the additional alternatives that are the green alternatives with the mussels and the Yeah, you're with me. With the mussels and the marsh, thank you. It's like I just lost it completely. And then think about those benefits and model them out in different ways. I'm going to show you what the results and how it might change the decision making. Thanks for that. So, one of the tracks that we used included a habitat equivalency analysis. If you don't know what it is, it does not matter. What's important is to say that the output from a habitat equivalency analysis, which is a methodology that is used by a lot of federal agencies, does not produce dollar outputs, but an ecological metric. But that ecological metric is still in a form that lets us look systematically across different alternatives and understand trade-offs. And so that's what we're looking at right here. We're looking at, so here, we'll do our blue. The blue are the benefits of natural infrastructure through this ecological metric. So you can see, unsurprising, that the green alternatives, like alternative 2, we're seeing very high ecological metric benefits. And then if you look over at our all-gray alternative 5, not a very big boost. It's not exactly surprising. If you look at the red, that's the avoided losses, e.g. property damage that's avoided from these different alternatives. Not surprising that our all-gray infrastructure solution shows very high protection in that manner. What I want you to focus on just for a second is alternatives 4 and 5. So, alternative 4 is a hybrid, so there's a mix of green and gray features, as was just so nicely laid out for me. 4 and 5 have the same value of property protection and community protection, but if you note, alternative 4 also has this additional benefit. So those environmental benefits as laid out by Ariana and Todd, recreation and otherwise. So all things being equal, if you're going to make a decision on the type of infrastructure, why wouldn't you choose the alternative that protects just as much but gives you additional benefit for your community? The answer is that we don't always have the information at hand. So, and I need to go faster. The other alternative that we did and that we really looked at was a benefit transfer. Again, I won't get into the specifics, but what's important is that this metric output is in dollars. And why that's important is because it allows us to go into put that result in a traditional decision-making cost-benefit framework. So what I'm going to do here is just show you how that metric then shows up in a full cost-benefit analysis of the 5 different alternatives and what those trade-offs are. Now, because this is a lot of information and I'm running out of time, what I want to point you to, so you'll see the benefits. So the benefits are the benefits of natural infrastructure if they exist and the avoided property damage or the community protection. The costs are the capital, construction, and operation and maintenance costs. The benefit minus cost gives us that cost-effective, how much did the benefits exceed the costs? In the beginning, you see we've got some negative numbers. It's not a great solution. That's what I would say. But if we keep going, what you see, if you just look down that right-hand column, is that alternative 4, our hybrid solution that includes a mix of green and gray infrastructure, has a nice high benefit exceeding the cost. So from a traditional decision-making structure, this alternative, similar to what we saw in the last alternative, where alternative 4, also under this different metric, showed us that we get good community protection and we also get additional benefits. So I know that I've raced through a 250-page report in about 6 minutes, but the moral of the story here is I hope that you'll take away that there are different ways that we can include the values of natural infrastructure in decision-making in very systematic ways to let us evaluate trade-offs, but there's also an opportunity for us to make better decisions about protecting our coastal communities where we're doing the protection and we're also providing additional benefits to keep these communities resilient into the future. I'll stop.